The antique shop sits on a quiet street in a historic downtown district, its weathered brick facade fitting perfectly among century-old buildings housing bookstores and art galleries. Vintage signs advertise estate sales and collectibles, while large windows display furniture, glassware, and decorative items arranged to attract passing tourists. The business has operated at this location for 8 years, becoming known among collectors for its rotating inventory of historical items including military memorabilia, vintage firearms, and estate liquidation pieces. The owner appears frequently in local preservation society meetings and sponsors historical education programs. The shop maintains all required federal licenses for dealing in antique and collectible firearms, with proper documentation filed annually and inspection records showing consistent compliance. Customers range from serious collectors seeking specific historical pieces to casual tourists purchasing decorative items as souvenirs. The business maintains a professional website showcasing inventory, with detailed descriptions emphasizing historical significance and collectible value. Online reviews praise the owner's knowledge of historical periods, authentication skills, and fair pricing on genuinely rare items. Federal investigators first noticed the operation through an unrelated investigation into a weapons trafficking network operating in 3 adjoining states. During that investigation, agents track a shipment that originates from this antique shop, supposedly a legal transfer of collectible items between dealers. The shipment draws attention because the receiving dealer has a history of compliance problems and associations with individuals prohibited from firearms ownership. Investigators request documentation of the transfer and find all paperwork appears proper and complete. But something about the pattern raises questions worth pursuing. A deeper examination of shipping records reveals a troubling pattern extending far beyond the single suspicious transfer. The antique shop ships to 17 different dealers across 8 states with remarkable frequency, often 3 to 5 shipments weekly moving through various carriers. For an antique business focused on historical collectibles, this shipping volume seems unusually high. Most legitimate antique dealers move inventory occasionally, perhaps weekly at most, because truly collectible items are relatively rare and sales happen at a measured pace among serious collectors. Financial analysis reveals that the shop grosses nearly $4 million annually, an extraordinary figure for an antique business in a small downtown district. Comparable antique shops in similar locations report annual revenues $300,000 and $800,000. The discrepancy suggests either this shop discovered an impossibly lucrative niche in the antique market, or revenue comes from sources beyond typical antique sales. Investigators request detailed sales records to understand how an antique shop generates such massive revenue. The records show thousands of transactions classified as antique firearms and collectible militaria sold to dealers in other states. Each transaction includes proper ATF forms documenting transfers between licensed dealers, with authentication certificates and historical provenance documents attached. The paperwork appears meticulous and complete, exactly what regulations require for legitimate antique firearms transfers. But the volume raises immediate red flags, because the shop somehow acquires and sells more antique firearms monthly than most specialized auction houses handle annually. Investigators begin examining the antique shop network more broadly, discovering it's not a single independent business, but part of a coordinated network of 17 locations across 8 states. All shops share similar characteristics: historic downtown locations, focus on antiques and collectibles, proper federal licenses, and unusually high shipping volumes between network locations. The shops appear to operate independently with different owners, but deeper investigation reveals complex corporate structures linking them through shell companies and shared financial interests. The network operates with sophisticated coordination that legitimate antique dealers would never require. Central inventory management software tracks items across all locations, allowing rapid transfers between shops based on customer demand. Shipping schedules show items moving constantly through the network, with pieces rarely staying at any single location more than 2 weeks. For genuine antiques, this constant movement makes no business sense because shipping costs and handling risks would eliminate any profit margins on legitimate collectible sales. An undercover operation begins in month 4 of the investigation. An agent poses as a dealer interested in acquiring inventory for a shop he claims to be opening in another state. He contacts the original shop expressing interest in establishing a business relationship for regular inventory transfers. The owner responds enthusiastically, explaining that the network specializes in moving collectible inventory efficiently between dealers who serve different regional markets. He offers to arrange a meeting to discuss wholesale pricing and shipping logistics. The meeting happens at the antique shop during business hours, with genuine customers browsing while the owner and agent discuss business in a back office. The owner explains that the network exists to facilitate interstate commerce in collectible firearms by maintaining inventory flow between regional markets where demand varies. He describes how items authenticated as antiques or collectibles can move between licensed dealers across state lines with minimal regulatory burden compared to modern firearms. The system allows the network to serve collectors nationwide while maintaining full legal compliance. The owner shows the agent the authentication process that supposedly verifies items as genuine antique or collectibles, qualifying for special regulatory treatment. Examiners supposedly verify manufacturing dates, confirm historical details, and issue certificates authenticating pieces as antique or curio relic items. These certificates then justify classification, allowing easier interstate transfer. The owner emphasizes that proper authentication is the key to the whole business model, because it determines which items can move freely between network locations. What the owner doesn't explicitly state but strongly implies is that the authentication process is fraudulent. Examiners working for the network receive items manufactured recently but artificially aged or modified to appear historical. They issue authentication certificates based on falsified research and manufactured provenance documents. Modern firearms get classified as antiques through systematic fraud, then enter the distribution network where they move between states under regulatory exceptions intended for genuine historical items. The pricing structure reveals the true nature of the operation. Genuine antique firearms typically sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars, depending on rarity and historical significance. The network's wholesale prices between dealers average only $200 to $300 per item, far below what authentic collectibles would command. This pricing makes sense only if items are modern firearms fraudulently classified as antiques, allowing them to move through interstate channels while avoiding regulations governing modern firearms transfers. The agent makes several test purchases over 8 weeks, acquiring items classified as antique firearms with complete authentication paperwork. Federal forensic examiners analyze these purchases and quickly determine they're modern firearms artificially aged through chemical treatments and mechanical wear simulation. Manufacturing marks show production dates within the past 5 years, completely inconsistent with claimed antique status. The authentication certificates are elaborate frauds backed by fictitious research and forged historical documentation. Investigators expand the probe to examine the full scope of the network's operations across 8 states. They identify 17 retail locations, 3 warehousing facilities, 2 authentication offices employing the fraud examiners, and a central coordination office managing logistics. Over 60 individuals appear involved in various capacities, including shop managers, shipping coordinators, authentication examiners, and financial managers. The network operates with corporate-level organization rivaling legitimate interstate retail chains. Surveillance teams document the shipping operation over 12 weeks of intensive monitoring. They photograph shipments leaving shops, track vehicles to distribution hubs, and follow packages through commercial carriers to destination locations. The volume proves staggering, with the network moving an estimated 1,500 items monthly through interstate channels. Over a year, this means 18,000 firearms moved through the fraudulent authentication and distribution system. All classified as antiques, but actually modern weapons diverted into illegal interstate commerce. The customer base extends well beyond serious collectors interested in genuine historical items. While shops maintain some legitimate antique inventory to support their cover, the bulk of business involves selling fraudulently classified modern firearms to buyers who understand exactly what they're purchasing. Some customers are dealers who resell to end users in states with strict modern firearms regulations. Others are individuals seeking to acquire weapons without the documentation and background checks required for legal modern firearms purchases. Financial analysis traces revenue flows through the complex corporate structure linking network locations. Profits get distributed through a maze of holding companies, limited partnerships, and offshore accounts designed to obscure the true ownership structure and make funds difficult to trace. The central figures behind the network remain hidden behind layers of corporate entities and nominee directors. Investigators spend months untangling financial records to identify the actual organizers who built and operate the interstate trafficking system. The network's documentation system proves remarkably sophisticated for a criminal enterprise. Every item receives a complete paper trail including purchase records, authentication certificates, transfer documentation, and sales receipts. The paperwork would satisfy casual regulatory review, which explains how the operation continued for years without detection. Only detailed forensic examination reveals the authentication fraud underlying the entire system, and such examination rarely happens without specific reason to suspect problems. The investigation reveals that the network exploited specific regulatory gaps in firearms law. Genuine antique firearms and curios, relics, receive special treatment under federal law because they're considered collectibles rather than functional weapons. This classification allows easier interstate transfer between licensed collectors and dealers. The network weaponized these exceptions by fraudulently classifying modern firearms as antiques, then exploiting the regulatory framework designed for legitimate historical collecting. Legal coordination begins in month 8, as prosecutors determine they have sufficient evidence for a comprehensive takedown operation. The case involves violations spanning 8 states, requiring unprecedented coordination between federal prosecutors, ATF field offices, and state law enforcement agencies. Legal teams prepare warrant packages covering all 17 retail locations, 3 warehouses, 2 authentication offices, the central coordination facility, and residences of key figures identified through financial investigation. The operational complexity requires months of planning to ensure simultaneous execution across multiple jurisdictions. The operation launches on a Thursday morning at dawn. Over 300 federal agents and state police execute synchronized raids across 8 states, hitting all network locations simultaneously to prevent warnings from spreading. Tactical teams breach shops, warehouses, and offices while employees are arriving or operations are just beginning. The goal is to secure all locations, detain all personnel, and seize records before anyone can destroy evidence or warn others in the network. At the original antique shop, agents arrive as the owner unlocks the front door. Tactical teams immediately secure the building, detaining the owner and 2 employees who arrived for opening procedures. Agents find the shop contains a mix of genuine antiques and fraudulently classified modern firearms, with authentication certificates prominently displayed alongside items to reinforce their supposed historical status. The back office yields shipping records, financial documents, and computers containing communications coordinating network operations. Simultaneous raids across 7 other states yield similar evidence at each location. Some shops resist initially, with managers attempting to lock doors or deny entry until search warrants get produced. Several locations employ security systems that alert central coordination when breached. But agents anticipated this and moved quickly enough to prevent effective response. By mid-morning, all 17 retail locations sit under federal control with personnel detained and evidence secured. The warehouse raids prove particularly productive, revealing the scale of the trafficking operation. Each warehouse contains hundreds of items awaiting distribution through the network, many still in manufacturer packaging with modern production dates clearly visible. Authentication examiners at these locations were in the process of artificially aging items when agents arrived, catching them literally in the act of creating fraudulent antiques. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. With modern firearms in various stages of artificial aging and stacks of blank authentication certificates ready to be filled out with false information, arrests begin immediately following the raids. Network organizers get detained at their residences, while shop managers, authentication examiners, and key employees face arrest at their work locations. By day's end, 63 individuals sit in federal custody across 8 states, all facing charges related to firearms trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. Several more remain at large with warrants issued, likely having fled when news of the raids broke through communication channels the network maintained. Evidence processing takes 6 weeks of intensive work by forensic teams. Agents catalog thousands of firearms, document artificial aging processes, analyze authentication certificates to prove fraud, and trace revenue flows through financial records. Digital forensics recover communications between network members discussing the fraudulent classification system and coordinating interstate shipments. Ballistics experts examine items classified as antiques and determine manufacturing dates, proving systematic fraud in the authentication process. The public announcement comes 1 week after the raids. Federal prosecutors hold a press conference in the state where the original investigation began, presenting evidence of the interstate trafficking network. The numbers shock observers. 8 states, 17 retail locations, 18,000 firearms moved through fraudulent classification over 3 years. Revenue exceeding $12 million. Prosecutors emphasize that modern firearms were systematically disguised as antiques to exploit regulatory exceptions, creating an interstate trafficking pipeline that completely bypassed regulations designed to prevent illegal firearms distribution. Media coverage focuses on the sophistication of the scheme and the brazenness of operating retail locations in plain sight across multiple states. Reporters interview customers who purchased items thinking they were genuine antiques, only to learn later they bought modern firearms fraudulently certified. Some customers express shock at being deceived, while others admit they suspected items weren't authentic, but purchased anyway, because the documentation provided plausible deniability. The coverage generates public discussion about regulatory gaps that allowed such extensive fraud to continue for years. Congressional hearings follow as lawmakers seek to understand how the network operated undetected for so long. ATF leadership testifies about resource constraints limiting inspection frequency and the sophistication of the authentication fraud that fooled inspectors during routine reviews. Lawmakers question why the high shipping volumes and unusual revenue patterns didn't trigger earlier investigation. The testimony reveals that the network deliberately stayed just below thresholds that would trigger automatic alerts, exploiting specific gaps in the oversight system. The network's reach proves more extensive than initial investigations suggested. As agents trace firearms through the distribution chain, they identify sales to customers in 15 states, not just the 8 where network locations operated. Some dealers who purchased from the network resold to others, creating multiple layers of distribution that put thousands of firearms into circulation across much of the country. Federal agents begin the massive task of attempting to trace and recover weapons while they're still identifiable through serial numbers and documentation. Criminal trials begin 14 months after the raids, with proceedings staggered across multiple jurisdictions to handle the volume of defendants. Prosecutors present overwhelming evidence, including recordings of the undercover agents' discussions with network members, forensic analysis proving authentication fraud, financial records documenting millions in illegal revenue, and testimony from cooperating defendants who provide inside details of operations. Defense attorneys struggle against the weight of evidence, with some arguing their clients were low-level employees unaware of the fraud, while others claim the classification decisions were honest mistakes rather than intentional criminal conduct. The central organizers face the most serious charges and longest potential sentences. Prosecutors charge them with leading a continuing criminal enterprise, a charge typically reserved for major organized crime operations. The charge enhancement reflects the interstate scope, sophisticated organization, and substantial revenue generated over years. The lead organizer faces a potential sentence of 30 years if convicted on all counts, with mandatory minimum sentences on the trafficking charges alone totaling 20 years. Convictions come steadily as trials conclude. The network's primary organizer receives a 28-year sentence, reflecting the scope of the operation and his leadership role. Shop managers receive sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. Authentication examiners who created the fraudulent certificates received 10 to 12 years, with judges noting they were essential to the entire scheme and their professional fraud enabled all subsequent crimes. Lower-level employees who cooperate receive reduced sentences of 3 to 6 years. Civil asset forfeiture proceedings seize all 17 retail locations, 3 warehouses, vehicles used in the operation, and financial accounts containing illegal proceeds. The total value exceeds $15 million, with funds distributed to support victim restitution and cover investigation costs. Several properties sell to legitimate businesses, while others remain vacant for extended periods, because their association with the criminal network makes them commercially undesirable despite attractive downtown locations. Regulatory reform follows the prosecutions at both federal and state levels. New federal laws close loopholes in antique firearms classifications, requiring more rigorous authentication procedures and creating centralized databases to track items claimed as antiques, moving in interstate commerce. States implement complementary measures requiring dealers to verify authentication certificates through federal databases before accepting antique classifications. The regulatory environment tightens substantially to prevent similar fraud from succeeding. Industry organizations representing legitimate antique firearms dealers support the reforms despite increased compliance burdens. Professional dealers recognize that fraud by criminal networks damages the reputation of legitimate collectors and dealers, making stricter oversight necessary to maintain public confidence. Trade associations develop enhanced authentication standards and voluntary certification programs to distinguish legitimate dealers from potential fraud operations. For communities where network shops operated, the revelation brings mixed reactions. Some residents express shock that businesses they patronized for years engaged in systematic fraud and illegal trafficking. Others claim they suspected something was wrong but never imagined the scale of criminal activity. Local law enforcement faces criticism for not detecting the operations, despite the shop's prominent downtown locations and high customer traffic. Officials implement new oversight mechanisms and training to help identify similar operations should they emerge. The investigation spawns numerous secondary cases as agents trace firearms throughout distribution networks, extending beyond the original 17 locations. They identify dealers who knowingly purchased fraudulently classified items for resale, charging them with trafficking violations. Some of these secondary investigations lead to arrests of individuals involved in other criminal enterprises who obtained weapons through the network. The case becomes a hub connecting to dozens of other investigations across multiple states. 5 years after the initial raids, federal agents continue working to recover firearms distributed through the network. Some turn up at crime scenes, their serial numbers finally traced back to network shops during post-incident investigations. Others get recovered during raids targeting criminal organizations, with forensic analysis connecting them to the fraudulent authentication system. Each recovery provides additional evidence of the operation's lasting impact and the difficulty of undoing damage caused by years of systematic trafficking. For prosecutors and investigators, the case demonstrates how criminal organizations can exploit regulatory complexity and interstate jurisdictional boundaries to operate large-scale trafficking networks. The sophistication of the authentication fraud and the corporate-level organization required to coordinate operations across 8 states indicate careful planning by individuals who thoroughly understood the regulatory system they were exploiting. The case becomes required study material for agents training to detect similar interstate trafficking schemes. The network's corporate structure provides lessons about how criminals use legitimate business formations to conceal illegal operations. The maze of holding companies, limited partnerships, and nominee directors created plausible deniability for actual organizers, while making investigation extremely difficult and time-consuming. Financial forensics teams spent months tracing funds through multiple corporate layers before identifying the individuals who actually controlled and profited from the network. Several defendants appeal their convictions and sentences, arguing that authentication fraud shouldn't support the enhanced charges for organizing interstate trafficking operations. Appellate courts reject these arguments, finding that the fraud was specifically designed to facilitate illegal interstate movement of firearms and therefore properly supported enhanced charges. The convictions and sentences become final, with primary organizers currently serving lengthy terms in federal correctional facilities, with projected releases in the 2040s. The empty shop buildings stand as reminders of the operation for years before eventual sale and renovation. Some buildings remain vacant for extended periods because their history makes them commercially undesirable despite premium downtown locations. Local preservation societies debate whether to acknowledge the criminal history or focus on the building's architectural significance when promoting downtown districts. Most eventually opt for complete renovation and rebranding to help communities move past the association. For federal law enforcement, the case demonstrates both the challenges of regulating interstate firearms commerce and the importance of interagency cooperation when investigations span multiple jurisdictions. The network succeeded for years by exploiting gaps between state regulatory systems and federal oversight. But once investigators recognized the pattern and began coordinating across jurisdictions, patient investigation assembled overwhelming evidence that resulted in successful prosecution of the entire network. The story concludes with awareness that similar operations likely exist, operated by other networks that observed this case and adjusted their methods to avoid detection. Federal agencies continue refining their oversight systems and interstate coordination procedures, using lessons from this case to develop better detection tools and investigative techniques. But the fundamental challenge persists: how to maintain effective regulation of legitimate antique firearms commerce while still detecting and stopping the small percentage who exploit regulatory exceptions for criminal profit. The antique firearms market continues with thousands of legitimate dealers operating honestly under enhanced regulatory oversight. Most support the reforms implemented after this case, recognizing that criminal fraud damages the entire industry's reputation. Professional dealers work with law enforcement to identify suspicious patterns and report potential fraud, creating informal networks that supplement formal regulation. The balance between supporting legitimate collecting and preventing criminal exploitation remains an ongoing challenge requiring constant vigilance. Vigilance remains essential, and complacency invites repetition. The work continues across thousands of dealers and millions of transactions annually, with investigators knowing that for every network like this that gets detected and dismantled, others may be operating undetected. The commitment to identifying and stopping interstate firearms trafficking remains a permanent priority, requiring sustained resources and constant adaptation to emerging criminal methodologies.